The night he told her she meant nothing to him. Hazel Quinn was standing in her own kitchen, still wearing her hospital scrubs, still smelling like antiseptic and 12-hour shifts, still holding a mug of chamomile tea she hadn't had a single sip of. She didn't cry. That surprised her more than anything, the absence of tears. She just stood there with the steam rising between her fingers and thought, so that's what that feels like. His name was Stellan Voss. She'd known him for 8 months. Known him the way you know someone when they appear in your life without any warning and rearrange everything without touching a single piece of furniture. You look around one day and realize the room is completely different and you have no idea when it happened. He'd walked into St. Matthew's Regional Hospital on a Wednesday afternoon in March, not as a patient but as a donor, some kind of anonymous endowment to the cardiac unit. She'd been the attending physician who crossed paths with him in the corridor outside the administrator's office, arms full of patient charts, already 15 minutes late for rounds, and she'd nearly knocked him flat on his back. He'd caught her charts before they hit the floor, all of them, with one hand. "You look like you haven't slept in 3 days," he'd said. 2, she'd corrected and walked away. She found out later, much later, who he was, what he was. By then, it was already too late for that information to make any practical difference. Stellan Voss was 38 years old, Montreal-born, and the kind of man that rooms went quiet for when he entered them. Not because people liked him, because people were afraid of him in the polite, careful way that wealthy cities develop. The kind of fear that wears good clothes and never makes a scene. He ran a private investment firm that, as far as anyone publicly knew, dealt in commercial real estate and infrastructure financing across Eastern Canada. What it actually dealt in was something Hazel would understand only in pieces, over months, like reading a book where every third page has been torn out. She was 31. She was a cardiologist in her 2nd year of attending practice. She had a 6-year-old daughter named Blythe, who was missing her 2 front teeth and currently obsessed with drawing horses, none of which looked anything like horses. She had a 1-bedroom plus den apartment in Westmount that she shared with Blythe and approximately 400 of Blythe's drawings. She had no time for a relationship, no interest in complicating her life, and no business getting involved with Stellan Voss. She got involved with Stellan Voss. It started slowly. Coffee, twice. Dinner once, at a restaurant quiet enough to have an actual conversation, which she hadn't done with another adult in what felt like geological time. He asked her questions and actually listened to the answers. He told her very little about himself and somehow made that feel like patience rather than secrecy. He was serious in a way that didn't feel cold. He made her laugh exactly twice the first night, and both times she'd been genuinely surprised. He met Blythe on a Sunday in May, accidentally. He'd picked Hazel up for brunch, and Blythe had been unexpectedly home from her weekend at her father's, sitting cross-legged on the living room floor surrounded by horse drawings. Stellan had crouched down without hesitation and asked, very seriously, what breed that one was. "That's Thundercloud," Blythe had said. "She's a Lipizzanner, but also part dragon." "The best ones usually are," Stellan had said, and Hazel had felt something in her chest shift in a way that scared her. She should have paid more attention to being scared. By July, they were something she didn't have a word for. Not officially together, not casual either, occupying some middle space that felt, to Hazel, like standing on ice that you know is holding your weight, but you're not sure for how long. She didn't push for definitions. She was too tired for definitions. She was simply happy in a way she'd almost forgotten was available to her. She noticed things during those months, small things she filed away without fully examining, the way certain phone calls made him leave the room. The men who were sometimes parked outside, patient and watchful in dark cars. The evening she'd reached for his jacket in the hallway, and he'd moved it before she touched it, casually, without explanation. The way restaurant staff treated him, not with the deference people showed the casually wealthy, but with something quieter and more nervous she noticed. She didn't ask. That was her first mistake, probably, though she's not entirely sure asking would have changed anything. The answer came on its own, on a Tuesday in October, in a way she hadn't anticipated. She was covering a late shift when they brought in a man named Felix Morin, 44, gunshot wound to the chest, arrived in critical condition. Standard trauma protocol. She spent 4 hours in surgery keeping him alive and succeeded, which she was professionally proud of. And then she went to fill out her charts and found 2 men she'd never seen before standing outside the ICU who looked at her in a way that made the back of her neck go cold. She called Stellan on her break. He answered on the first ring. "Are you at the hospital right now?" "Yeah." "Yes." "Stellan, who are those men?" "Don't go anywhere alone." "I'm coming." He arrived in 20 minutes and the 2 men disappeared. He didn't explain where they went. He took her to a small office near the staff lounge and closed the door and stood with his back against it and looked at her the way people look at you when they're deciding how much of the truth you can handle. "The man you operated on tonight," he said. "His name is Felix Morin. He works for a man named Arsenault. Do you know that name?" She didn't, he explained, in the flat and careful voice of someone reading from a document they wish didn't exist, that Philippe Arsenault was the head of one of the oldest crime organizations in Quebec. That Felix Morin had been shot because he was carrying something that belonged to Arsenault. That the organization wanted that something back before Morin could talk. Hazel listened to all of this. Then she said, "And who are you exactly in relation to all of this?" The pause before he answered told her everything she needed to know. "Complicated," he said. "I have time," he told her. Not everything. She understood later that there were layers he hadn't reached yet, or hadn't chosen to, but enough. The firm was real. The investments were real. The other part of his business, the part that operated in spaces where law enforcement agencies ran out of jurisdiction and willingness simultaneously, was also real. He'd been managing a negotiated peace between 3 competing organizations in the city for 4 years. Felix Morin's shooting was a violation of that peace. The men outside the ICU were Arsenault's people, trying to determine whether Morin had given her anything before she operated. "Had he?" Stellan asked. "He was unconscious when they brought him in." Stellan nodded. "Good. That's your response?" "Good?" "Hazel, don't." She stood up. Her hands weren't shaking, which impressed her. "I need you to be honest with me right now. Is Blythe in danger?" The fact that he didn't immediately say no made her heart drop 6 inches. "She's not currently at risk," he said. "The conflict is contained, but I want to move her somewhere safe while I resolve this." While I resolve this, as if he were talking about a scheduling conflict. As if the word resolve meant something clean and manageable, rather than whatever it actually meant in his world. She wanted to scream at him. She wanted to throw something. She wanted to cry and couldn't, which was a pattern she was apparently developing. Instead, she said, "How long have you known this was going to become my problem?" He held her gaze. "I knew there was a risk. I chose to believe I could manage it before it reached you." "And was that a decision you made for me or for yourself?" He didn't answer. She left the hospital at 2 in the morning and drove to her mother's house in Pointe-Claire and sat in the driveway for 10 minutes before going inside. Her mother was awake. She always was when Hazel was working nights. Some maternal insomnia she'd never managed to turn off. She made tea without being asked, and they sat at the kitchen table, and Hazel told her almost nothing useful, and her mother held her hand and didn't ask questions she couldn't answer. Blythe was asleep in the guest room, curled around a stuffed horse she'd named Professor Clementine. Hazel watched her sleep for a long time, in the weeks that followed Stellan's people, and she understood now that there were people, multiple, organized and specific, kept a quiet perimeter around her life. A car outside the hospital. A man she started recognizing near Blythe's school pickup. She didn't know how to feel about this. She resented it and was grateful for it, and resented being grateful for it. She and Stellan didn't speak for 11 days. Then he called and she answered, and they had the most honest conversation they'd ever had, which was mostly her asking questions and him answering them with the methodical honesty of someone who has decided that the cost of full disclosure is lower than the cost of losing the thing in front of him. "Why did you let this get as far as it did?" she asked. "With me, with Blythe in the picture. Why didn't you end it before it became this?" The pause this time was different, longer. She could hear him breathing. "Because I didn't want to," he said finally. Which I understand is not a sufficient answer. It's not. I know. She didn't hang up. That probably said something about her. Things were fragile after that. Functional but careful, the way a broken bone feels after it's been set. Present in every movement, not exactly painful, but never not there. She went back to work. Blythe went back to school. The quiet perimeter continued. Felix Moran recovered and was transferred to a secure facility, and whatever information he carried apparently went with him without incident. She thought it was settling. She thought the worst of it was behind them. Then, on a gray Friday in November, one of Stellan's men arrived at the hospital and asked her, very quietly, if she had ever heard the name Delacroix. She had not. He gave her a name, Bernard Delacroix, 71 years old, and a photograph. She recognized the man immediately. She'd operated on him 14 months ago. Routine valve replacement, successful, unremarkable. She'd had no idea who he was. He was Arsenault's primary financial architect, the man told her. He had documents on him when he came in for surgery. A drive. He asked to have it secured in the hospital's patient valuables system. It was never retrieved. She stared at him. You're telling me that somewhere in St. Matthew's records system there is a piece of evidence belonging to a crime organization. More than evidence. It's a record of every financial transaction Arsenault's network has conducted in the past decade. Every name, every account, every arrangement. And you want me to— Mr. Voss wants you to do nothing. He wants you to stay where you are and not ask about this. Then why are you telling me? The man looked uncomfortable for the first time. Because Arsenault's people already know it exists and they've identified you as the attending physician on Delacroix's case. They believe you know where it is. The cold returned. The particular cold she'd felt outside the ICU that night in October. The kind that starts in the back of the neck and moves down. Does Stellan know you're telling me this? A pause. He knows now. Her phone rang 30 seconds later. Hazel. His voice was tighter than she'd ever heard it. I need you to listen to me very carefully. I need you to leave the hospital with Marchetti and go directly to your mother's house and stay there until Stellan. She kept her own voice steady through pure professional habit. Years of delivering difficult news to frightened families left you with this, at least. The drive is still in the hospital. Silence. I know exactly where patient valuables goes when an account is marked inactive after discharge. It goes into long-term record storage. Room BS7, sub-basement. She paused. I checked before Marchetti finished his sentence. I'm a cardiologist. I'm fast. Another silence, different in quality. She could almost hear him recalibrating. You are not going to retrieve that drive, he said. Obviously not alone. That would be genuinely stupid. She started walking. But I have access to B7, and you presumably have people who can have it secured and out of reach of Arsenault within the hour.
So,
I'm going to suggest we stop having this conversation and start coordinating, because if Arsenault's people know about the drive and they know about me, they're already on their way here. He was quiet for 3 seconds. Marchetti goes with you, already walking beside me. Hazel, I know. I'm on my way. Room B7 was exactly where she said it was. The drive was exactly where hospital protocol said it would be, in a sealed envelope in a numbered storage drawer, logged under Bernard Delacroix's patient file, filed inactive 14 months ago, untouched. She had it in her hand in 4 minutes. She gave it to Marchetti. She did not look at it. She was back at the elevator when she heard the stairwell door at the end of the corridor open. There were 2 of them. She didn't know their names. They were not Stellan's people. She understood this immediately and completely, the way you understand certain things when adrenaline makes everything very clear and very simple. Marchetti stepped in front of her. He said something into his earpiece. She backed against the wall and thought, be useful, not afraid. Those are not the same thing. What she did was practical. She hit the elevator button and kept her hand on the sensor so the doors stayed open, which meant they had an exit, and the men coming down the corridor did not have a contained space to work with. She also hit the emergency intercom button inside the elevator with her elbow as she stepped partially inside, which triggered the hospital security protocol and meant that within 90 seconds there would be staff responding to the sub-basement. Marchetti got them into the elevator. The doors closed. She breathed. She found out later that Stellan arrived at the hospital 4 minutes after they came up from B7. She found out later that the two men in the corridor were detained by hospital security and subsequently handed to people Stellan described only as the appropriate authorities, which she chose to accept as a term of art rather than press further. What happened that night, after Blythe was confirmed safe, after the drive was somewhere outside Arsenault's reach, after Marchetti drove her to a house in Outremont she'd never been to before, and she sat in a well-lit kitchen drinking very good tea and waiting, was that Stellan arrived and sat across from her at the kitchen table and looked at her like she was something he hadn't expected. "You retrieved it," he said. "I located it. There's a difference. You triggered the security. I know the protocols." She wrapped both hands around her mug. "The drive is safe. Blythe is safe. The situation with Arsenault, is that manageable now?" "Yes. Because of the drive. Partly." He looked at the table, then back at her. "Hazel, don't say you're sorry. I am, though. I know you are." She set her mug down. "I'm angry with you. I'm going to be angry with you for a while. You let me walk into something without enough information to make real choices about it, and that's not something I can just set aside because it worked out." She held his gaze. "But I need you to understand that I'm angry because I'm still here. I'm not walking away. I'm telling you what this needs to look like going forward, and you're going to listen, and we're going to figure out what that means." He was very still. "What does it need to look like?" "Honest. Everything. Even when it's complicated. Even when you think you can manage it before it becomes my problem. Because you can't always. And I am not a person who needs to be managed." She paused. "I'm a cardiologist. I deal in incomplete information under time pressure every single day. You don't have to protect me from hard truths. You have to give them to me fast enough that I can actually use them." He was quiet for a long moment. "I've never done this," he said. "Whatever this is, neither have I. Not like this." She picked up her mug again. "That's not an excuse. That's just context." He reached across the table, and she let him take her hand. His was very warm and very certain, and she thought, this is still terrifying. That's not going away. But terrifying and worthwhile are not mutually exclusive, and I've known that for years. It's just that it usually applies to my job. Blythe asked Stellan, the following Sunday, if he wanted to see her new horse. The new horse was named Admiral Frostpaw and had 7 legs and wings, and was, according to Blythe, the fastest horse in 3 provinces. "The wings seem redundant then," Stellan said seriously. Blythe considered this. "They're for emergency." "Smart," he said. "Always good to have a backup." Blythe handed him a crayon. "Green. You can draw the mountains. Horses need mountains." He drew the mountains without complaint, and with, Hazel noticed, genuine concentration. Blythe approved of them. She gave him a second crayon, blue this time, and told him the river went on the left. Hazel stood in the kitchen doorway with her chamomile tea and watched them and felt the thing in her chest that had shifted and may shift again more decisively, into somewhere it might actually stay. She had not expected this. She had not expected any of it. She had expected, at 31, to be building something quiet. Her practice, Blythe's childhood, something manageable and hers. She had not expected a man who rearranged things without touching them, who made her laugh twice, and then showed her the most frightening parts of himself, and trusted her to stay anyway. She had stayed. She intended to keep staying. There was still a lot she didn't know. There were still rooms in his life that were closed to her, decisions being made in languages she didn't speak yet. There would be more difficult nights. She was a realist. Her training had made her one, and Blythe's existence had finished the job. But she was also, she'd come to understand, someone who walked toward hard things rather than away from them. She'd chosen a career that required it. She'd raised a child alone and done it without resentment. She'd stood in a hospital sub-basement and thought, be useful, not afraid, and meant it. She could do that here too. Blythe laughed at something Stellan said, really laughed. The full-body laugh that she got from her grandmother and that Hazel had been delighted by since the first time she heard it, when Blythe was 2 days old, and Hazel had been awake for 40 hours, and laughing was the only thing left. The sound of it moved through the apartment like light. Hazel took a sip of her tea, It was, for once, still warm. She stepped back into the living room and sat down on the floor beside them, and Stellan handed her a crayon, yellow, without looking up from the river, and Blythe said, very seriously, "You're doing the sun, Mama." Exactly right. And Hazel drew the sun, and outside the November dark pressed against the windows, and inside it was warm, and that was enough. That was, she thought, exactly enough.